The market smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, and the metallic tang of old iron rounded every breath. A hawker's bell rang thinly as if to cut the air, and the murmur of the crowd was a cloth dragged over stone. In the center, a hastily built platform held a man whose presence bent the light. He was large enough that even the sheriff appeared smaller beside him, cuffed and slumped, a dark sheen like oil blooming across his shoulder. People pressed in, eyes hungry for spectacle, hands worrying coins and shawls and the small mercies of gossip. Elin felt the wind push against her skin, cool and sharp, as if the mist from the river had come to eavesdrop. When the official announced the sum to redeem him, voices rose and fell like tide. The wound that darkened his skin pulsed with a slow, unnatural cold, and under the coarse fabric, his chest rose and fell with the measure of someone not entirely human. Somewhere close, a child sniffed and coughed on dust. Elin's fingers closed on the last coins she had kept for winter bread. For a heartbeat, she measured risk and need. For another, she remembered hands she had mended and oaths she had not spoken aloud. Then she stepped forward and laid her coins on the official's palm. The crowd hissed, curious and scornful, and when the sheriff nodded, the man was handed to her without thanks. In that instant, something in the air tightened, as if a wire had been pulled taut. Who is this stranger with a bite of moon under his skin? And what would it cost a healer to keep him from dying? The question set in the villagers like a coal, hot and possible to carry or drop. Elin led him through lanes that smelled of wet wool and peat, the murmur of the market left behind for the creak of carts and the far bleat of sheep. She walked with a child named Isla at her side, small and watchful, and old Oren the blacksmith called after them with a crude blessing. The man stumbled, and at one point reached for the railing of her gate, fingers like stone. At home, the hearth was low, smoke leaning toward the rafters like a tired bird. She laid him on the pallet, listening to the river of his breath. He smelled of rain and fur and something iron-sweet. Elin unpicked his shirt with gentle fingers, revealing the mark that had drawn her across the square. A crescent where the skin had darkened to a silvery black, and a shallow bite ringed and pale, as if made by teeth both small and vicious. Her own hands trembled as she collected bowls, thread of linen, and a pot of nettle decoction. Elin, who helped gather herbs, brought fresh comfrey and rue, and Maeve, the washerwoman, stood in the doorway with eyes like a judge. They murmured names with the measured care of people who knew how quickly kindness could be misread. The man opened his eyes then, and they were a blue that seemed to remember older skies. He said one name, under his breath, syllables like stone falling, and Elin felt her breath hitch as if someone had polished her memory. In the treatment room, Elin worked as her grandmother had taught her, with hands that remembered the shape of bones and a mind that catalogued smell and sound. She washed the wound in warm water, turned with brewed chamomile to soothe, and a splash of vinegar to cut infection. Her fingers pressed salves of crushed marigold and dried belladonna wrapped in linen, and she placed a cooling poultice over the silvered skin. The man flinched when her palm hovered above the bite. He tasted metal on his tongue and spoke, low. "The moon took more than my name." She asked who had done this, and he only said, "They called me Alpha." He slept, and his breathing became a rough whisper. Elin perceived then a tremor under the skin that was not fever alone, but a stirring, a thing like the hum of a hive. She slept poorly, watching for signs of fever, and at dawn discovered teeth marks along her own wrist where she had unconsciously clutched him in a moment of pain. The bite stung with a warmth she could not name. Her pulse beat a different rhythm around that mark. She tasted copper, and the memory of a forest night rose in her throat. Nightmares followed her all morning, the man running through mist, wolves circling like questions, a stone altar half buried under peat. When she rose to fetch more water, she found a visitor at her door. The sheriff, Calder, came with a retinue that smelled of leather and rule. He carried himself like a man who had worked out what belonged in law and what belonged in the ledger. Behind him was Brother Ewan of the court, with papers creased and pen-smudged, and Apothecary Rowan, who watched the man on the pallet with a professional hunger. Calder's voice gritted when he spoke. The crowd had not accepted Elin's payment without interest. "You know the law," he said, eyes sweeping the room. "One who is marked by the moon is property and peril. He was taken under suspicion of raids. The court will have reason to examine him." Elin felt the wooden floor press into her feet. She met Calder's gaze steadily. "I bought him," she said, simply. "He is under my roof and under my care." Calder's jaw flexed. "You have taken a dangerous thing. The village will not allow shelter of what might bring wolves to doorsteps." That word, wolves, gathered a sound like wind at a ruined eve. Elin answered with the only things she had learned from an old life of tending, patience, and the knowledge of herbs that tasted of sun. "Let him be kept for tonight," she asked. "Let me do what I can. If he is dangerous, if he is a threat, then let the law decide in the daylight." Calder studied her as if weighing coin. "Very well," he said, after a long breath, "but the court will send word. He will be examined by the apothecary." Elin nodded. Within her, an oath took shape. She would not hand a living thing over to fear if a cure still had a chance. Her backstory was the sort that stitched itself into the soil of the place. She had been a child of the pasture and the stone, the daughter of a woman who died with her hands in the earth, and a father who kept the hearth and hummed old tunes. As a girl, she had wandered the ridge where the clovers grew tall, and learned the names of plants as if they were siblings. She had apprenticed under Maeve, then under her grandmother Lysa, who taught her not only poultices, but how to listen to the wind as if it could tell you where a sore would open. Her training had a roughness to it. She learned to patch bones and to pry splinters without flinching. There was a loss she carried like a smooth pebble in her pocket. At 14, the fever came and took her mother, and Elin had lain awake on that night, hands pressed to a pulse that slowed and went cold, and she had vowed then to trade money for life in the smallest ways. That vow became a craft. She learned a secret rite for staunching blood that her grandmother whispered in 3 breaths, and she hid that knowledge from men who feared what women who knew too much could do. In her early 20s, she had touched the cheek of a soldier and learned what it meant to be suspected for tenderness. Rumor had made her a witch in a season, and the parish had more than once asked if she would leave. She did not. Her roots went deeper than rumor. She chewed on the memory of the winter she had saved a boy from a bone infection with boiled roots and a prayer whispered under her breath, because sometimes faith and practice looked the same. That night, the ache of being seen as both healer and other finally settled into a steady shape. Her reputation was small and fierce, like a lamp in a cottage window. It had kept neighbors fed and children less afraid when the cough came. It had not, however, kept her safe from the sheriff's ledger or from the old fear that rose when the moon cut a white coin into the sky. Apothecary Rowan had a backstory that slotted neatly into the machine of the court. He had studied in the court town beyond the pass, where jars were labeled in a precise hand, and tinctures were organized by lineage. He had learned formulas that made politicians look better by keeping soldiers fit and wives docile. Rowan's ambition was a steady, calculating thing. He once had a lover with a fondness for rare fungus, and the memory of that love had been traded for secrets he thought might profit him. He had found favor by offering the court a method to color venoms and to mask harvest failures as disease. In his youth, he had loved a woman named Rye, who kept bees, and he had promised her the world. But when she took ill, he had chosen a medicinal theory that cost her life in exchange for a publication and a guarantee of patronage. From then, he had been careful with tenderness. That care hardened into a hunger for influence. When Rowan looked at the marked man, his pupils narrowed in interest that smelled like ledger sums. He had come to the village not only because of law, but because the court had whispered of a chance to test a theory on a living body, to refine a potion into something the crown could use to bend clans to its will. His ambition made him dangerous. It turned kindness into a currency to be invested. The treatment continued in the hush of the house. Elin prepared a poultice with crushed marigold, willow bark, and a slow tincture of elderflower to ease fever. She chanted the rhyme of tending that her grandmother had taught. It was not prayer, but a way to count breaths. She bound the man's shoulder with linen soaked in a vinegar infusion and laid a strip of raw silver under the cloth, a family trick said to pull corruption away from flesh. As she worked, he stirred and opened his eyes. "You should not have bought me," he said, voice low as gravel. She answered in the voice of a woman who had mended more than wounds. They talked in exchanges that stretched long and quiet, each sentence a small claim staked in the dark. "What is your name?" she asked. "Call me Aldrich," he replied. "Why did they call you Alpha?" she pressed. "Because the pack bowed," he said, gaze drifting to the severed light through the shutters. "Because I led once, because a thing in me remembers the wild and the call of teeth." He spoke of nights where the moon made maps on the ground. He spoke of hands that tried to straighten him into a soldier, and of men who wanted to braid his wildness into a weapon. His words were few, but heavy. Elin asked for the story of the wound. He told of a fight at the edge of the old wood, where iron had met fang and fire had chased oath away. He fell silent then, as if telling had cost power. The bite across his shoulder had not healed as a normal wound. Instead, it pulsed like a half-heart, seeking. Elin felt that seeking reach across the room and graze the palm she had used to unbutton his shirt. She flinched, thinking she had imagined it, and then found on her wrist a faint crescent tinge. A call came at mid-morning. The crowd had not emptied. Gossip hung from doors like washing. Calder returned with men whose boots thudded like small storms. "The apothecary will examine him before noon," Calder announced. "If your treatment changes the evidence, you may be held. If he is wild, then he is a danger to children." Elin looked at Isla curled near the hearth and thought of how small things could tip the balance of a yard. "I will let the apothecary look," she said. Rowan arrived with instruments that gleamed and paper spooled like the language of power. He moved with the quick precision of someone who has dissected truth into marketable parts. He prodded, smelled, and murmured to himself. "There is a silvering here," he said, fingers careful, as if handling a new thought. He took samples, crushed a fragment of the darkened skin, and placed it on heated glass, the smoke smelling sharply of iron and something like wet hair. He wrote notes that could be read like maps, and his eyes glinted when he saw how the substance behaved. To Elin, it smelt like old forests and a thing that remembered bone. Rowan suggested a trial to see if the mark could be tinctured, and in his tone there was a hint of bargain. Calder, practical and brittle, wanted a verdict. "If he is no threat, we will return him to the pasture. If he is wild, he must be bound." The words bound something in Elin like a net. That night, Aldrich thrashed in fever. He called out in strange syllables that were not quite human. Elin sat by his side and pressed cool cloths to his brow, tasting the salt of his breath. The fever was not only heat, but an ache of memory, as if muscles were remembering how to run. She decided then to perform a minor rite, a set of motions to soothe the animal part without cutting it loose. She drew a circle in flour on the floor, lit a thin candle, and set herbs in the pattern of her grandmother's teaching. She sang low, voice thick with the chord of old words. It was a procedure she had used for stubborn fevers and for bones that refused to set. The ritual required exact steps. Massage the lymph nodes, apply a binding salve, whisper the name of the injured part to the flame to let it be heard and soothed. The process was technical and precise. It began with a poultice of willow and marigold placed at the base of the skull to draw out heat. Then a gentle pressure was applied along the shoulder blade to encourage the muscles to remember alignment. The candle's smoke was passed in an arc over the wound to clear clotted will from the air. Finally, a binding stitch of silver thread was set beneath the skin to draw the silvering outward over 3 nights. The description alone took minutes, but the movements were delicate and required a practiced hand, fingers that knew when to stop. After the first night, the man calmed and slept like one who had been given a single borrowed piece. In the days that followed, the village watched and whispered. Jory the mason came by with a shovel leaning on his shoulder and peered through the window. He said, voice low, "She thinks she can mend him." Maeve, once an ally and half the gossip mill, lent bread with a look that held hope and fear. Elder Gwyn offered a curt blessing and shuffled away, uncertain. The apothecary returned with a letter from the court that smelled of ink and chain. Aldrich was to be taken to the castle for a formal examination. There was a new urgency in the air, as if the valley had been told it needed to make a decision on itself. Some nights, wolves howled from the ridge, and the sound threaded through the rafters like a needle. Aldrich grew stronger, his voice gaining a rougher cadence. He began to move with a certain economy of motion, eyes sharp and quick. The mark on his shoulder darkened under a thin sheen of new skin. Once, in the night, he rose and slipped outside into the mist. Elin followed, barefoot, breath pressing against the cold. He stood at the edge of the wood and whispered into it. For a moment, she thought she heard responses, a chorus like leaves answering a stone. She wanted to reach him, but held herself back, knowing a thing in him might be tied to his freedom. The courtroom summons was written in official ink and nailed to the tavern door. It announced a hearing, the matter of Aldrich of the Wilds. Elin cleaned her hands until the knuckles shone and gathered what small notes she had, remedies, a list of witnesses, and a remembering of the rites she had performed. Calder rode with the court party, and Rowan came with vials in a case like the armor of an apothecary. The road to the castle climbed into colder wind. Pine needles rasped under the wheel of the cart, and the view opened onto a bleak sweep of pasture where sheep huddled like thoughts. At the castle hall, the air smelled of polished wood and old breath. Inside, candles guttered like old grievances. The judge sat with a ledger large enough to be a small boat. Rowan presented his findings with the calm of one who has numbers on his side and curiosity in his smile. He spoke of a substance in the wound that reacted to silver and to certain tinctures, and suggested that what was in Aldrich could be isolated and exploited. He proposed, soft as silk, that the court might fund trials. In a voice like a blade wiped on wool, he hinted that a weapon could be made. Of the wildness, Elin felt her hands tighten around the strap of her satchel. "You would turn a living thing into an instrument?" she demanded. "You would make killers in the name of safety?" The judge inclined his head. "We would make order," Calder stated, blunt and gray. "We will take measures to protect the villages." Aldrich was made to stand and endure the probe of questions. He answered in a way that was human and also not. When asked about raids, he spoke of survival, of neighboring clans, of a hunger that reached beyond law. Faces in the hall hardened and turned away. After the hearing, Rowan offered a bargain. He meant to charm, as most men of his trade charm. "We could keep him alive and study him," he said. "We could devise means for your people to be safe. I could even suggest protections for your family, for a price." His words were measured like coin. Elin heard the undercurrent. He could make Aldrich into a tool and keep her dependent for favors and supplies. It was subtle blackmail, an institutional version of a hand in your pocket. Aldrich, for his part, stood quiet. He looked at Elin and said, "If they take me, they will change me into what they want me to be." The choice then moved like a slow wheel in Ellen's chest. Protect him and risk the court's wrath, or hand him over and watch him be slowly refashioned into an instrument of domination. She felt the old pebble in her pocket warm with the weight of the decision. She refused Rowan's bargain with a voice that showed the edges of the person she had become. "I will not sell his life to anyone. If you want him for study, take him by force. I will not let fear or science decide his fate." Rowan's face did not change, but his hands tightened over the straps of his case. Tension settled like a storm cloud. The court returned to the village with an order. Aldrich was to be transported to the castle for observation under guard. Calder prepared to collect him under the charge of law. The village reacted in a chorus of murmurs. Jory spat on the ground and declared it a folly. Elin said prayers that threaded through her jaw. Maeve took a loaf to Ellen's door and left a note that said simply, "Choose what your heart knows." Isla hid behind curtains and watched the men prepare a cart. As they were about to take him, a howl rose from the ridge, long and hollow. It cut through the day like a scythe. Aldrich's eyes sharpened, as if something within recognized a kin. He turned to Elin and said low, "If you will not come, then let me go free before their hands make cages of me." Elin put her palm on his arm. The touch startled her, because the mark there burned faintly, like a coal placed close to her skin. She felt a decision unspool into movement. That night, she gathered herbs and prepared a rite not to change him, but to bind him to a choice: to remain human and accept the cost of that choice, or to answer the wild and run into the wood. The rite involved tagging his wrist with a silver cord and whispering an oath. The cord would not chain his body, but would mark a binding agreement, ancestral in concept, acknowledging his autonomy. The procedure was technical and required precise handling of silver and herb oils. The cord was threaded through a small loop and warmed by candle smoke before it lay against his skin. Elin explained to him every step, and he took the cord with a steadiness that was startling. He asked in a quiet voice, "If I choose you, what becomes of me?" She answered, "You become chosen, and also bound to a life where you cannot hunt the weak." He smiled faintly, a thing like sunrise behind storm. On the night of the rite, the wood echoed with an old song. Elin spoke the words her grandmother had taught, and Isla hummed with a clarity that it both cheered and frightened her. The circle of flower had smudged underfoot, candles guttered, and threw shadows like doubts. When Elin tied the cord and Aldrich whispered the oath, his breath came out in a long exhale that seemed to loosen something inside him and make room for a quieter heart. Then everything broke. Footsteps crashed through underbrush, and men with torches and iron rushed the clearing. Rowan and Calder had not been idle. They had decided that ritual would not be permitted to alter the evidence. The men seized Aldrich with rough hands. Elin threw herself between them and called out, "He promised to come with us to the castle if you will listen to reason." Calder sneered and shoved her aside. A scuffle erupted. Aldrich roared then, a sound like 100 stones falling into a well, and the cord at his wrist snapped. For a horrible instant, he was both terrifying and magnificent, a creature of muscle and howl. He broke free, and then, with a movement quick as a thought, he turned and sank his teeth into the shoulder of one of the captors. Blood spattered like ruined lace. The men staggered back, some falling to the ground, others frozen by fear. In that chaos, Aldrich grabbed Elin and ran into the wood, the scent of him filling the air like a promise or a threat. The men shouted, and torches flared. Rowan cursed softly, not for the man they had lost, but for the lost data. The chase was a storm of branches and breath. Elin ran with a ferocity she had not known she possessed, feet slapping wet leaves, heart beating hard enough that she thought it might burst. Aldrich moved like a shadow that was also a force of nature, weaving between trunks and over roots as if the forest remembered him. At one point she saw him look back, eyes black and bright, and he reached for her as if to claim something more than protection. He said, barely audible, "You gave your coins for me. Now you will have me." The words landed heavier than the rain. She could have been terrified, and sometimes she was, But in that moment she felt both danger and the strange clarity of belonging. He took her hand, and for a time they moved as a single thing through mist and light. When they stopped, breathless and ashamed of the law, the sky had cleared to a thin, wintry light. Aldrich turned to her with an intimacy that was immediate, no slow courting strip to warm it. "You chose me among all things," he said. "Among fear and hunger and the ledger, you chose to spend your last coins." He placed his hand against her cheek, and the mark near his shoulder seemed to shimmer. "You will have a choice now," he said. "Claiming is not theft. It is a way of making sure you do not leave me when the wolves call." Elin felt a tempest inside her, a wish for home and a pull toward the wild, and an understanding that to be chosen by him would change the shape of her life in a way that law could not reverse. She did not answer at first, for the world held its breath. Then she reached up and touched his wrist where the silver cord had once rested, and said, softly, "I did not buy you to own you. I bought you to save you. If claiming means staying, then we must write terms." He barked a laugh, sudden and afraid, and said, "Terms are fine, as long as you stand when the moon bites." She smiled, a tired and fierce thing, and in the mist they made a quiet, tacit promise. At approximately 1/3 of this tale, you might be sitting at your screen wondering what you would do in Elin's place. If you were in the market with bread smoke on your clothes and a stranger whose skin bore a mark like the moon, would you give your last coin to save him? Write in the comments, "I would save," or "I would let him go," and tell us in a line why. Your answers matter more than you might think. They show what a community values in secret, whether self-preservation outlays mercy, and they help shape what stories we tell next. If you save, say why you believe in second chances. If you choose safety, explain what fear looks like when it is your family at stake. We read every comment and learn how our audience sees the world these characters must live in. Now, continue watching to see how Elin's choice pulls threads that change not only one life, but a whole valley. The morning after the forest, things altered. Aldrich learned to keep certain bodily truths folded away from the public eye. He ate slowly, watched children with a softness that didn't match his hands, and sometimes, when the moon rose, made a faint sound like remorse. The village adjusted to his presence with the wobble of an animal settling into an uneasy coop. Calder watched from the edge like a man waiting for a trap to spring. Rowan, stung by his loss of control, began to whisper to those who had power and coin. He suggested that the mark might be a vector for a tincture to be refined, and some in the court took interest. The apothecary's willingness to weaponize what he could not own created a new threat, a program to craft poisons that could be tuned to clan blood. Elin realized then that the danger was not only in wild things, but in men who wanted to turn living power into policy. Tension returned in thicker waves. One evening, Aldrich left the house and did not come back until dawn with a lamb slung over his shoulder. He had taken one of the sheriff's men by surprise and used the gift to feed a child. People whispered both praise and accusation. A group led by Jory and Maeve demanded a town meeting, wanting to know if sheltering Aldrich made them complicit in crime. Elder Gwyn mediated, voice low and old. He called for patience and for the law to speak, but in private he came to Elin and sat down on her stoop, hands trembling like leaf. "You must know," he said, "that the court will not be content with one man." He told of a design to use the wound as a pattern to make controlled soldiers, men who would be part wolf and part instrument. The idea was monstrous and methodical. Elin felt nauseous at the page of possibilities. She had to decide whether to fight a court that had coin and books, or to try to sway the village to a gentler course. She gathered witnesses, people who had seen Aldrich do small mercies. Isla, now braver, who said he had mended her scraped knee. Orin, who had been saved from a fall by Aldrich's quick catch. Elin, who vouched for the man's steady kindness. In the meeting, voices rose and fell like tide. Some argued for fear and law, for safety and order, others for compassion. The decision was delayed by argument and by the slow engine of officialdom. Rowan grew bolder. He sent a messenger to the castle with a silvered substance and a recommendation. The crown, intrigued by the possibility of control, sent an apothecary from the city to consult. He was a thin man named Ludlow, who asked questions with the dry politeness of someone who wrote treatises for pay. Ludlow visited and watched, and he too smelt possibility of a tincture that could be codified. He spoke frankly to Elin in the evening. "Imagine a legion that answers to you," he said, "trained and tempered with the control of a serum. No more raids, no more chaos on the borders." His words were like a net tossed over a child's hope. Elin thought of the lamb left at her door and of the blood spilled in the woods. She could see the map Ludlow proposed, neat and terrifying. "There is always a cost," she said. "A life traded for order is still a life lost." Ludlow smiled, not unkindly. "But sometimes it is for the greater good," he suggested. The greater good had a dry, clinical voice and smelled faintly of cedar and coin. When the court pressured, the village split. Calder threatened to arrest those who resisted. Rowan offered protection in exchange for samples and custody. Elin found herself answering to a world that measured kindness in laws and tests. One night, she and Aldrich confronted the plan. He was raw with anger and hardened by fear. "They will make soldiers out of what I am," he said, teeth flashing. "They will take the hunger and make it obedient." Elin had no authority to stop the court, but she had something else, the knowledge of rights and a web of people who trusted her hands. She convened a small group, Maeve, Orin, Isla, Jory, and Elder Gwyn. They listened as she told them of Rowan's plans and of Ludlow's cold eye. "We cannot let them take our people and turn them into weapons," she said. They agreed to resist in small ways that might frustrate the court long enough for the story to change. The greatest moment of tension came when a party from the castle returned with a writ and a wagon. The writ demanded Aldrich be surrendered for study. Men with iron faces arrived to take possession. Elin stepped forward and stood in front of the cart. Calder tried to push, but she planted herself and spoke. "You will not take him while I stand," she said. "If you use force, you will make enemies of the whole valley." Aldrich, though newly calm, felt the old animal stir at the threat of cages. He could have fled. Instead, he reached for Elin and said softly, "I trust you." The words were simple and enormous. For a second, Calder faltered, as if his ledger had been opened to a page that displeased him. Then hands moved, and Aldrich was taken in a rougher way than before. There was a scuffle, and blood again. This time, the court's brutality made some villagers see their complicity as physical and not only moral. They rose as one and demanded the cart be opened to an honest discussion. The sheriff, outgunned by public outrage and by the fear of creating martyrs, backed down. Realizing that the court would not give up, Elin proposed an alternate, a ritual of acknowledgement, one that would make public the court's power. Choice Aldrich had made to accept a life among them under watch and not as a subject of experiments. In the circle of the green stone, under the watch of the village and the eyes of men from the court, Elin performed a fuller rite. She spoke words that bound memory to oath. The ritual required a technical description that the court could understand and respect, so she documented each step for transparency. The procedure included cleansing the wound with a saline infused with herb smoke, tying a silver cord warmed by flame to the limb to symbolize voluntary bond, and reciting a sworn acknowledgement of autonomy before witnesses to prevent any future claims of forced study. This combination of process and public agreement was meant to counter any secret appropriation. The technical description was precise and plausible, using measures of salt concentration, the properties of silver in drawing impurities, and the legal language of public oath to create a barrier. Witnesses signed the declaration with ink and seal, and for a time the court was obliged to accept that Aldrich's status had changed by will. But peace was a fragile glass. The apothecary moved to slow poison and study in the shadows. Rowan proposed to certain officials that a measured sample of the mark could be synthesized. He worked nights at the bench, mixing powders and distilling fumes, his notes growing longer and more dangerous. Elin grew suspicious and started to keep watch. One night, she caught Rowan stealing through her garden. They confronted him with Isla and Jory at her side. Words were exchanged that hummed with the threat of violence. "You would have made him fodder," Elin told Rowan. Rowan's eyes were keen and tired. "He is a phenomenon," he said. "Phenomena are studied," she answered, with the kind of anger that is hard to live with and easier to wield. "People are not phenomena." The confrontation ended without blows, but with Rowan's departure and a promise that the court would come again. The climax approached on a raw dawn when the court decided to send a squad to the Green Stone with writs and men to take Aldrich by force if necessary. Elin and her allies prepared for a confrontation that mixed ritual and fear. They worked through the night, rehearsing words and placing signs to confuse trackers. Aldrich, for his part, moved in odd rhythms, sometimes distant and sometimes dangerously near. The night before the planned seizure, he took Elin aside and said in a voice that held both amusement and sorrow, "If they take me, remember that wolves are not only teeth. They are a shape of belonging. If you claim me as your own, know what you are claiming." Elin pressed her forehead to his and felt, beneath the rough skin, a person who chose not to be made into a tool. "I claimed you because I could not stop myself," she said. "I will fight to keep you free in the way I know." When the men arrived, it was not with the pomp the castle believed, but with a cold efficiency sharpened by arrogance. They expected the village to cave under the weight of authority. Instead, they encountered people who would not be bullied into compliance. The scene was chaotic, a wash of noise and motion. At some point, Aldrich changed. The change was not a monstrous transformation, but a controlled, awful beauty. He moved like a blade through air, not to harm, but to disarm. He tore through the men's plan, soft as thunder, and turned their strength into confusion. In the scuffle, Rowan fell, his notes scattered and ruined, his hands cut by broken glass and the grit of the road. Calder was unhorsed. The writ was trampled underfoot. When it was over, there were bad men wounded, and the village had its scars. Aldrich stood among them, breathing heavy and human, and he did not issue a howl. He looked at Elin and spoke a small sentence. "You keep me from the cage and from becoming an instrument. I will not be made into their tool." In the aftermath, the court filed complaints and threats. Men came with letters and cold promises. Yet the people who had seen the man choose to stay had changed. Some, like Jory, who had at first spat words of fear, now brought round a rudimentary repair to the fence and fixed the ridge beam with hands that worked differently. Maeve baked an extra loaf and left it on Aldrich's pallet. Oren, the blacksmith, made a small iron loop and fashioned a sign that said in plain letters, "Belonging is not owned." The apothecary's schemes faltered as his notes were ruined and as men of the court saw that enforcement might cost more than it was worth. Rowan withdrew into the shadows, nursing his plans and his bitterness. Calder strode off to his ledger and redid calculations for control, recognizing that sometimes law was better when it bent with people rather than broke them. Months passed, and the change settled into a new pattern. Life resumed its rhythms, and yet a new current ran under it. Aldrich taught the young boys to move with a lightness that made them laugh at being clumsy with sticks. He helped mend a fence, and he stood quietly when grief walked through the village. Elin continued her work as a healer, and sometimes at night she felt the crease of his hand on her waist, like an insistence she did not refuse. The village came to accept, grudging and then warmer, that a person could be wild and also be neighborly, The court sent fewer emissaries. Rowan wrote from the city with threats in the margins. Elin answered letters with courtesy and refused to be baited. She said to Aldrich one evening, fingers trailing along a simmering pan, "We are not the same as we were. We have traded a night of safety for a life that demands more courage." Aldrich looked at her, tired and amused, and said, "And I got you. Did you ever expect that?" She smiled, remembering the market and the last coin on her palm. 1 month later, the valley had settled into a strange peace. The lambing season had been kinder than last year, and the markets returned to their usual pace. People still whispered sometimes at the sight of Aldrich, and Isla would point with pride when he helped mend a boy's arm. There was a new ritual on certain nights, when men and women would gather to tell the story of the purchase and the choosing, and it became less a shame and more a tale of complicated mercy. The elders sat more often by the fire and spoke of oak and oath. Elin planted fresh marigolds near her door. Aldrich came with a gift of stones from the ridge and a promise that he had no intention of leaving. He had cut a small notch into the doorpost in the shape of a moon to mark their pact. 3 months on, the court's voice had quieted to a long-distance murmur. Trade continued, though some city folk watched the valley with a new wariness. A small posse from the castle came once and found the village ready for conversation rather than conflict. They met with Elin and Aldrich in a manner that felt like diplomacy more than tribunal. The riders asked questions and listened to the names of those who had witnessed the rites, names that the village offered with a slow dignity. While the court continued to study from afar, its appetite for control lessened because of cost and because the people would no longer be pawns. Elin and Aldrich walked the pasture at dusk and watched lambs nose their mothers. He showed her how to track a fox, not to kill, but to understand the shape of its path. She taught him how to brew a tea to still a cough. In private, they discussed fears and small comforts, sometimes arguing about where to hang a pot or how to mend a hole in the roof. And through the agreeable tangle, they forged a domestic map that was mostly love and a constant negotiation. 6 months later, the valley had a rhythm that felt new and owned. The court still sent letters, but their tone was cooler, more legal than hungry. Rowan had moved on to a different patronage and was less interested in the valley, though his shadow remained as a cautionary tale around the tavern's fire. Aldrich was welcomed as a helper and regarded as a man whose past claws at him sometimes, but whose present was hand and hearth. Elin had become, in the eyes of the valley, not simply a healer, but a guardian of sorts, a woman who had traded coin for commitment and who had learned how to hold a fierce thing without breaking. Their house was filled with the odd sound of a howl at night, softer than before, often answered by a child singing. The lambs grew fat, and the market had a sweeter tang. People came to Elin for small remedies and leave with more than bandages. They left with a sense that every life had a complicated cost and a complicated gift. In the end, what they both gained was not a perfect peace, but a negotiated life. She had spent the last of her coins to rescue an alpha, and he had, without pomp, claimed her as his. They both learned that claiming is not conquest, but an ongoing consent that must be renewed in small acts. The village adjusted and grew around the new shape of belonging, and the court learned, grudgingly, that power has limits when the people it would govern are not willing to be instruments. If you liked this story and want more about rights, remedies, and choices that weigh heavily on small places, subscribe to follow the next chapter of this valley's tale, and leave a comment sharing who you would defend in a trial of law and loyalty. In the dim glow of one final evening, they stood on the ridge, and Elin said, eyes on the moon, "I used my last coin, and I bought more than a living man." Aldrich squeezed her hand, and the moon scattered silver on the grass like an old promise. And she answered, and I found a home that demanded I change to fit it.